Hi, lounging leopards. Good morning. I am going to read the next couple of chapters of the Boxcar Children to you guys. And sorry I missed you on Friday, but I will be posting this today, and I will be reading to you guys again on next Friday. So I will see you then. All right, we're going to start with the new home, a new home. Keep still, whispered Jess. Benny obeyed. The three children were as motionless as stone images, huddled inside the freight car. Jess opened her mouth in order to breathe at all. Her heart was thumping so wildly. She watched like a cat through the open door, in the direction of the rustling noise. In a moment, the trembling bushes parted, and out crawled a dog. He was an Airedale, and was pulling himself along on three legs, whimpering softly. Jess drew a long breath of relief and said to the children, "It's all right. Only a dog. But he seems to be hurt." At the sound of her voice, the dog lifted his eyes and wagged his tail feebly. He held up his front foot. "Poor doggie," murmured Jess soothingly, as she clambered out of the car. "Let Jess see your poor lame foot." She approached the dog carefully, for she remembered that her mother had always told her never to touch a strange dog unless he wagged his tail. But this dog's tail was wagging, certainly, so Jess bent over without fear to look at the paw. An exclamation of pity escaped her when she saw it, for a stiff, sharp thorn had been driven completely through one of the cushions of the dog's foot, and around it the blood had dried. "I guess I can fix that," said Jess briskly, "but taking the thorn out is going to hurt you, old fellow." The dog looked up at her as she laid his paw down and licked her hand. "Come here, Violet and Benny," directed Jess. She took the animal gently in her lap and turned him on his side. She patted his head and stroked his nose with one finger, and offered him the rest of her bread crust, which she had put in her apron pocket. The dog snapped it up as if he were nearly starved. Then she held the soft paw firmly with her left hand, and pulled steadily on the thorn with her right hand. The dog did not utter a sound. He lay motionless in her lap until the thorn suddenly let go and lay in Jess's hand. "Good, good!" cried Violet. "Wet my handkerchief," Jess ordered briskly. Violet did so, dipping it in the running brook. Jess wrapped the cool, wet folds around the hot paw and gently squeezed it against the wound, the dog meanwhile trying to lick her hands. "We'll surprise Henry, won't we?" laughed Benny delightedly. "Now we got a dog!" "Ah, to be sure," said Jess, struck with the thought, "but that isn't what I intended for a surprise. You know, I was intending to get a lot of blueberries and maybe find some old dishes in a dump or something." "Can't we look while you hold the dog?" asked Violet anxiously. "Of course you can, pet," said Jess. "Look over there by those rocks." Benny and Violet scrambled through the underbrush to the place Jess pointed out, and investigated. But they did not hunt long, for the blueberries were so thick that the bushes almost bent over with their weight. "Oh, Jessie!" screamed Benny. "You never saw so many in your life. What do we pick 'em into?" "Come and get a clean towel," said Jess, who noticed that Benny was already picking into his own mouth. "But that's just as well," she thought, "because he won't get so hungry waiting for the milk." She watched the two children a moment as they dropped handfuls of the bluish globes on the towel. Then she carefully got up with her little patient and went over and sat down in the center of the patch. The berries were so thick she did not have to change her position, for the towel held over a quart. "Oh, dear," sighed Jess. "I wish I could hunt for some dishes so we could have blueberries and milk." "Never mind tonight," said Violet. "We can just eat a handful of berries and then take a drink of milk when Henry comes." But it was even better than that, for when Henry came he had 2 bottles of milk under one arm, a huge loaf of brown bread under the other, and some golden cheese and wax paper in his pocket. But you should have seen Henry stare when he saw what Jess was holding. "Where in the world—" began the boy. "He come to us," volunteered Benny. "He come for surprise for you, and he's a nice doggie." Henry knelt down to look at the visitor, who wagged his tail. It wouldn't be a bad thing to have a watchdog, said Henry. I worried about you all the time I was gone. Did you bring some milk? Inquired Benny, trying to be polite, but looking at the bottles with longing eyes. Bless his heart, said Jess, struggling to her feet with the dog. We'll have dinner right away. Or is it supper? Call it supper, suggested Henry. For the last thing we'll have to eat today. And then tomorrow we'll start having 3 meals every day, laughed Jess. It was certainly a strange meal, whatever it was. Jess, who liked above all things to be orderly, spread out the big gray laundry bag on the pine needles for a tablecloth. The brown loaf was cut by a very excited little hostess into 5 thick squares, and cheese into 4. Dogs don't eat cheese, Benny remarked cheerfully. The poor little fellow was glad of it, too, for he was very hungry. He could hardly wait for Jess to set the milk bottles in the center of the table and heap the blueberries in 4 little mounds, one at each place. I'm sorry we haven't cups, Jess remarked. We'll just have to drink out of the same bottle. No, we won't, said Henry. We'll drink half of each bottle, so that will make at least 2 things to drink out of. Good for you, Henry. We'll drink half of each. Good for you, Henry, said Jess, much relieved. You and Benny use one, and Violet and I will use the other. So the meal began. Look, Benny, directed Henry. Eat a handful of blueberries, then take a bite of brown bread, then a nibble of cheese. Now a drink of milk. It's good, mumbled Benny to himself all through the meal. You must not imagine that the poor wandering dog was neglected, for Jess fed him gently as he lay in her lap, poking morsels of bread into his mouth and pouring milk into her own hand for him to lap up. When the meal was over and exactly half of each bottle of milk remained, Jess said, We're going to sleep on beds tonight, and just as soon as we get our beds made, we are all going to be washed. That'll be fun, Benny, added Violet. We'll wash our paws in the brook, just the way Cinnamon does. First, let's gather armfuls of dry pine needles, ordered Jess. Get those on top that have been lying in the sunshine. Jess laid the dog down on a bed of moss as she spoke, and started energetically to scoop up piles of the fragrant needles. Soon, a pile as high as her head stood just under the freight car door. I think we have enough, she said at last, taking the scissors from Violet's work bag. She cut the laundry bag carefully into 2 pieces, saving the cord for a clothesline. One of the big squares was laid across Benny's hay and tucked under. That was the softest bed of all. Violet's apron and her own she cut off at the belt. I'll sleep next to Benny, said Henry, with my head up by the door. Then I can hear what is going on. A big pile of pine needles was loaded into the freight car for Henry's bed and covered with the other half of the laundry bag. The remainder of the needles Jess piled into the farthest corner of the car for herself and Violet. We'll all sleep on one side, so we can call it the bedroom. What'll the other side be? Inquired Benny. The other side? Repeated Jess. Let me think. I guess that'll be the sitting room, and perhaps some of the time the kitchen. On rainy days, maybe the dining room, added Henry with a wink. Couldn't it be the parlor? Begged Benny. Certainly, the parlor. We forgot that, agreed Jess, returning the wink. She was covering the last 2 soft beds with aprons. The tops of these aprons are washcloths, she said severely. Then, armed with the big cake of soap, she led the way to the brook. The dog watched them anxiously, but when Jess said, Lie still, he obeyed. From the moment Jess drew the thorn from his foot, he was her dog, to obey her slightest command and to follow wherever she went. The clean, cool brook was delightful, even to Benny. The children rolled up their sleeves and plunged their dusty arms into its waters, quarreling good-naturedly over the soap and lathering their stained faces and necks with it. When they were well rinsed with clear water, they dried themselves with the towel. Then Jess washed both towels nicely with soap, rinsed them, and hung them on the clothesline of tape, which she had stretched between 2 slender birch trees. They flapped lazily in the wind. Looks like home already, Jess, said Henry, smiling at the washing. The tired children clambered into the bedroom, Jess coming last with the wounded dog. We'll have to leave the door open. It's so hot, said Henry, lying down with a tired sigh. and in less than 10 minutes they were fast asleep, dog and all, asleep at 6 o'clock, asleep without naming the dog, without locking the door, without fear. For this was the first night in 4 that they had been able to go to sleep at night, as children should. Housekeeping. The next morning Jess was up before the others, as was fitting for a little housekeeper. That is, she was first if we except the dog, who would open one eye instantly every time his little mistress stirred in her sleep. He sat watching gravely in the door of the car as Jess descended to get breakfast. She walked from the little waterfall quite a distance down the brook, looking at it with critical eyes. "This will be the well," she said to herself, regarding a small but deep and quiet basin just below the falls. Below that she found a larger basin, lined with gravel, with flat stones surrounding it. "This will be the washtub," she decided, "and now I must go back to the refrigerator." This was the strangest spot of all, for behind the little waterfall was a small, quiet pool in which Jess had set the bottles of milk the night before. Not a drop of water could get in, but all night long the cool running water had surrounded the bottles. They were now fairly icy to the touch. Jess smiled as she drew them out. "Is it good?" asked Benny's voice. There he sat in the corner of the car, swinging his legs, his arm around the shaggy dog. "It's delicious," declared Jess, "cold as ice." She climbed up beside him as she spoke, bringing the breakfast with her. The other 2 children sat up and looked at it. "Today, Jess," began Henry, "I will go back to town and try to get a job mowing lawns or something. Then we can afford to have something besides milk for breakfast." Milk suited Benny very well, however, so the older children allowed him to drink rather more than his share. Henry did not waste any time talking. He brushed his hair as well as he could without a brush, rolled down his sleeves, and started for town with the second dollar. "Glad you got a dog, Jess," he called back as he waved his straw hat. The children watched him disappear around the curve and then turned to Jess expectantly. They were not mistaken. Jess had a plan. "We'll explore," she began mysteriously. "We'll begin here at the car and hunt all over these woods until we find a dump." "What's a dump?" inquired Benny. "Oh, Benny," answered Violet, "you know what a dump is. All old bottles and papers and broken dishes." "And wheels?" asked Benny interestedly. "Will there be any old wheels?" "Yes, maybe," assented Violet. "But cups, Benny. Think of drinking milk out of a cup again." "Oh, yes," said Benny politely. But it was clear that his mind was centered on wheels rather than cups. The exploring party started slowly down the rusty track, with the dog hopping happily on 3 legs. The 4th paw, nicely bandaged with Jess's handkerchief, he held up out of harm's way. "I think this is a spur track," said Jess. "They built it in here so they could load wood on the cars, and then, when they had cut all the wood, they didn't need the track anymore." This explanation seemed very likely, for here and there were stumps of trees and decaying chips. Violet took note of these chips and remembered them some days later. In fact, both girls kept their eyes open and pointed out things of interest to each other. "Remember these logs, Violet, if we should ever need any," said Jess, pointing. "Blackberry blossoms," returned Violet briefly, turning one over gently with her foot. "Big flat stones," remarked Jess, later on, as they came upon a great heap of them. Here the track came out into the open sunshine, and broken pieces of rail showed clearly where it had joined the main track at some time in the past. And here, from the top of the wooded hill, the children could plainly see the city in the valley. They walked along the track, picking out a church steeple here and there, forgetting for a moment the object of their search. "There's a wheel!" Benny cried triumphantly from behind. The girls looked down, and with a glad cry of surprise, Jess recognized a dump at the foot of the hill. They found it not composed entirely of ashes and tin cans either, although both of these there were in great profusion. It was a royal dump, containing both cups and wheels. "Oh, Benny!" cried Jess. "If it hadn't been for you—" She hugged him, wheel and all, and began turning over the rubbish with great delight. "Here's a white pitcher, Jess," Violet called, holding up a perfect specimen with a tiny chip in its nose. "Here's a big white cup," said Jess delightedly, laying it aside. "Want a teapot, Jessie?" inquired Benny, offering her an enormous blue enameled affair without a handle. "Yes, indeed," cried Jess. "We can use that for water. I've found 2 cups and a bowl already. And Violet, we ought to be looking for spoons, too." Violet pointed without speaking to her little pile of treasures. There were 5 iron spoons covered with rust. "Wonderful!" pronounced Jess with rapture. Indeed, it is doubtful if collectors of rare and beautiful bits of porcelain ever enjoyed a search as much as did these adventurers in the dump heap. Benny actually found 4 wheels, exactly alike, probably from the same cart, and insisted upon carrying them back. To please him, Jess allowed him to add them to the growing pile. "Here's a big iron kettle," observed Violet. "But we won't really cook with a fire, will we, Jess?" "We'll take it back, though," replied Jess with a knowing look. "We can pile lots of dishes in it." They could and did, but not until after Benny had discovered his beloved pink cup. It was a tea party cup of bright rose color, with a wreath of gorgeous roses on it, and a little shepherdess giving her lamb a drink from a pale blue brook. It had a perfectly good handle, gold into the bargain. Its only flaw was a dangerous crack in the lamb's nose and front feet. Jess made a cushion for it out of grass, and laid it on top of the kettle full of treasures. All the things, even the wheels, were laid on a wide board, which the 2 girls carried between them. Can you imagine the dishwashing when the party returned to the freight car? Children do not usually care for dishwashing, but never did a little boy hand dishes to his sister so carefully as Benny did. On their hands and knees beside the clear little cool washtub, the 3 children soaked and rinsed and dried their precious store of dishes. Jess scoured the rust from the spoons with sand. "There," she said, drying the last polished spoon. The children sat back and looked admiringly at their own handiwork. But they did not look long. There was too much to be done. "Jess!" exclaimed Violet. "I'll tell you." Violet seldom spoke so excitedly. Even Benny turned around and looked at her. "Come and see what I noticed inside the car last night." Both children followed her, and peered in at the door. "See, on the wall, right over on the other door, Jess?" Now all Jess could see were 2 thick chunks of wood nailed securely to the closed door, opposite the open one. But she whirled around and around as fast as she could, clapping her hands. When she could get her breath, however, she skipped over to the board they had carried, dusted it nicely, and laid it carefully across the 2 wooden projections. It was a perfect shelf. "There!" said Jess. The children could hardly wait to arrange the shining new dishes on the shelf. Violet quietly gathered some feathery white flowers, a daisy or 2, and some maidenhair ferns, which she arranged in a glass vase filled with water from the well. This she put in the middle, with the broken edge hidden. "There!" said Jess. "You said 'there' 3 times, Jessie," remarked Benny contentedly. "So I did," replied Jess, laughing. "But I'm going to say it again." She pointed and said, "There." Henry was coming up the path. Earning a living. Henry had all sorts of packages under his arm and in his pockets, but he wouldn't open them or tell a thing about his adventures until dinner was ready. He said, "Jess, you're a wonder!" he exclaimed when he saw the dishes in the shelf. The big kettle was selected, and they all began to pick blueberries as fast as they could, telling Henry meanwhile all about the wonderful dump. At last the tablecloth was spread, and Henry unwrapped his parcels before the whole excited family. "I bought some more brown bread," he said, producing a loaves, "and some more milk, from the same little store where I went yesterday. It's kept by a little old man. It's called a delicatessen shop. He has everything in his store to eat. I bought some dried beef because we can eat it in our fingers, and I bought a big bone for the dog." "His name is Watch," Jess interrupted. "All right," said Henry, accepting the name. I bought a bone for Watch. Watch fell on the bone as if he were famished, which indeed he nearly was. It was a rapturous moment when Jess poured the yellow milk into 4 cups or bowls, and each child proceeded to crumble the brown bread into it with a liberal scattering of blueberries. And then, when they ate it with spoons, nobody was able to speak a word for several minutes. Then Henry began slowly to tell his tale. "I earned $1 just this morning," he began proudly. "I walked along the first shady street I came to, nice houses, you know, and there was a fellow out mowing his own lawn. He's a nice fellow, too, I can tell you, a young doctor." Henry paused to chew blissfully. "He was pretty hot," Henry went on, "and just as I came to the gate, his telephone rang. I heard it and called after him and asked if he didn't want me to finish up. And he said he did," cried Jess. "Yes," he said, "for goodness sake, yes." Henry smiled, answering. "You see, he wasn't used to it. So I mowed the lawn and trimmed the edges, and he said he never had a boy trim it as well as I did. And then he asked me if I wanted a steady job." "Oh, Henry!" cried Violet and Jess together. "I told him I did. So he said to come back this afternoon any time I wanted, or tomorrow. He said he didn't care which, just when, any time." Henry gave his cup a last polish with his spoon and set it down dreamily. "It's a pretty house," he went on, "and there's a big garden behind it, vegetable garden, and an orchard behind that, cherry orchard. You ought to see the cherry trees. Well, when I was trimming the edges near the kitchen door, the cook came and watched me. She's a fat Irish woman." Henry laughed at the recollection. "She asked me if I liked cookies. Oh, if you had smelled them baking, you'd have died laughing, Benny. Delicious! So I said I did, and she passed me out one, and when she went back I put it in my pocket." "Did she see you?" asked Jess anxiously. "Oh, no," said Henry confidently, "for I carefully chewed away for a long time on nothing at all." Benny began to look fixedly at Henry's pocket. It certainly was still rather bulgy. "When I went, the doctor paid me $1, and the cook gave me this bag." Henry grinned as he tossed the paper bag to Jess. Inside were 12 ginger cookies with scalloped edges, smelling faintly of cinnamon and sugar. "I'm going to keep track of everything I earn and spend," said Henry, watching Jess as she handed round the cookies with reverence. "How are you going to write without a pencil?" asked Jess. "There are pieces of tailor's chalk in my work bag," said Violet. Henry gave his younger sister a gentle pat as she returned with her work bag and fished for the chalk. While the girls rinsed the empty plates in the brook and stored away the food for supper, Henry was beginning his cash account on the wall of his bedroom. It was never erased, and Henry often now looks at the account with great affection. Soon the girls came to inspect it. Meanwhile, Benny looked on with great delight as Watch tried to bury his bone with only one paw to dig with. "Earned $1. Cash on hand $3.85, read Jess aloud. Below he had written, "Milk 24 cents, bread 10 cents, bread 20 cents, cheese 10 cents, milk 24 cents, beef 20 cents, bone 5 cents, cloth 10 cents." "Cloth!" exclaimed Violet. "What on earth?" Henry laughed a little and watched her face as he drew out his last package and handed it to her. "I thought we ought to have a tablecloth," he explained, "so I got a yard at the 10-cent store. But it isn't hemmed, of course." With a cry of delight, Violet unwrapped the brown cloth with its edge of blue. Her clever fingers were already evening the 2 ends. She was never so happy as when with a needle. Henry set off again with a light heart. Here was one sister curled up happily against a big tree, setting tiny stitches into a very straight hem. Here was another sister busily gathering pliant twigs into a bundle for a broom with which to sweep the stray pine needles from the house. And here was Benny, curled up sound asleep on the ground, with the dog for a pillow. It was quite late when Henry returned. In fact, it was nearly 7 o'clock, although he didn't know that. Several treasures had been added in his absence. The broom stood proudly in the corner with a slim stick for a handle. The new tablecloth had been washed and was drying on the line, and Jess, who had decided to wash one garment a day, had begun with Benny's stockings. When Henry came, they were being put on again with much pride by Benny himself. Violet had darned a big hole in each. This time Henry himself could not wait to tell his sisters what he had. He passed them the package at once, with shining eyes. "Butter!" cried Jess with a radiant face. It was butter, cool and sweet. Nobody remembered that they had been a week without tasting either butter or meat when at last they sat down to their royal supper. "These are trick spoons," explained Henry. "Turn them upside down and use the handle, and they become knives." They were knives. Anyway, they were used to spread the delicious morsels of butter on the brown loaf. With dried beef and a cookie for dessert, who could ask for better fare? Certainly not the 4 children, who enjoyed it more than the rarest dainties. "I washed the doctor's automobile this afternoon," Henry related. "Then I washed both piazzas with the hose, and tomorrow I'm going to hoe in the garden. Oh, wouldn't I love to have a nice cold swim in that brook?" Henry was hot and sticky, certainly. He looked with longing eyes at the waterfall as he finished the last crumbs of his supper. "I wonder if we couldn't fix up a regular swimming pool," he said half to himself. "Of course we could," replied Violet, as if nothing were too difficult. "Jess and I know where there are big logs and big flat stones." "You do, eh?" said Henry, staring at his gentle little sister. "Well, why couldn't we, Henry?" struck in Jess. "Just a little below this there is a sort of a pool already. Only not big enough." "We sure could," cried Henry. "Some day I'll stay home from work and we'll see." Nobody realized that Henry had been working only one day in all. Anyway, it seemed as if they had always lived in the comfortable home in the freight car, with Henry flying back and forth from the city each day, bringing them new surprises. Henry went to bed that night with a head full of plans for damming up the brook. He almost shouted when he thought suddenly of Benny's wheels. He began to plan to make a cart to carry the heavy stones to the brook. And that was when he first noticed that Watch was not asleep. He could see his eyes shining red in the darkness. It must have been around 11 o'clock. Henry reached over and patted his rough little back. Watch licked the hand, but didn't close his eyes. Suddenly, he began to growl softly. "Shh," said Henry to the dog. Now thoroughly startled, he sat up. Jess sat up. He did not hear a sound. "Better shut the door," breathed Henry. Together they rolled the door very slowly and softly until it was shut. Still they did not hear anything. Still Watch continued his uneasy growling. Violet and Benny slumbered on. Jess and Henry sat motionless with their hearts in their mouths. "Supposing it was some other tramp," whispered Jess. "Somebody else that wanted to sleep here." "Watch would bite him," whispered Henry briefly. Jess never knew what confidence Henry had in the faithful dog. Then a branch cracked sharply outside, and Watch barked out loud. Jess smothered the dog instantly in her arms. It had been a bark, and it was loud, clear, and unmistakable. "That settles it," thought Henry. "Whoever it is knows there's someone in here." And the boy waited with the new broom in his hand, expecting every moment to see the door open from the outside. But nothing happened, nothing at all. The children sat in perfect silence for at least a half hour, and nothing more was heard. Watch sniffed a little when Henry finally rolled the door open again, but he then turned around 3 times and lay down beside Jess, apparently satisfied at last. Taking the dog's conduct as a sure guide, Henry composed himself for sleep. "It must have been a rabbit or something," he said to Jess. The occupants of the freight car slept peacefully until morning. And that, my friends, is where we're going to end it today. And I look forward to seeing you again on Friday. Take care. Much love, Bisbee.